Hello, my name is Malcolm Griffiths, and I'm going to talk to you today about mechanical properties of stainless steels in nuclear applications. Now, coming from the Canadian nuclear industry, where I've worked for most of my career, I perhaps have a slightly different perspective on the role and the importance of stainless steels in nuclear applications, and hopefully I can share some of that perspective with you today. So we'll start by giving you an outline. I'll give a brief description of nuclear applications of stainless steels, and I'll describe what I mean by defining what a stainless steel is and that sort of thing. Then move on to discussing some important physical metallurgy of stainless steels as it pertains to the use of these alloys in reactors. And then I'll move on to actual radiation effects. I'll give a brief introduction by talking about what radiation damage is, and then talk about radiation effects, hardening, swelling, and the effects of mechanical properties. And then I'll summarize. So I'm gonna turn off my ugly mug here and put it in presenter mode like that, and so that you're not distracted by my picture there in the bottom corner. So we'll start. Here is a section through the ternary phase diagram, the iron, chrome, nickel section. And as you can probably see, what I've done here is I've identified some important alloys that are used in nuclear reactors. In particular, the nickel alloys here in this phase field, in the gamma austenite phase. And then up here we have the alpha phase materials, which is basically the BCC type materials, low alloy steels, carbon and low alloy steels, ferritic steels such as HT9 and the 400 series steels. And overlapping, there's a two-phase region here, dual phase structures where you can get some alpha and some gamma phase, gamma being the austenite, alpha being the BCC phase. And this overlapping region is where most of the 300 series of steels reside. There is one particular alloy that's used in nuclear reactors, A286, which is somewhat similar to the nickel alloys, the ferritics here. I guess I'll switch on the pointer. A286 here, and it's somewhat similar to the nickel alloys, which reside in this region of the phase diagram. This phase diagram, ternary, is at 400 degrees C. And what I put on here is a dashed line to denote the boundary where we would define a material as a stainless steel, and that's typically 11.5 to 12% chromium. And another boundary which is one where what often you see in publications is what people generally define as a nickel alloy. If it's greater than 30% or 20, actually depends on who you talk to, somewhere between 28 and 30%. If it's greater than 28 or 30% nickel, then it's classed as a nickel alloy. A286, which is less than 30%, is classed then as a steel, even though it has many of the properties that nickel alloys, and in particular, the precipitation hardening. So many of you have probably seen this famous diagram showing PWR and where different materials are employed in the core region and the balance of plant. We're going to be mostly interested, well, we're going to be almost exclusive, well, we are exclusively interested in the core region today. And in the core region, there's a number of different austenitic stainless steels that are used for the internal structure. There are also austenitic nickel alloys, typically are used in control rod, drive mechanism housings, springs, and other internals. But the one we're going to focus on today is the austenitic stainless steels. Likewise, BWR has a number of different stainless steel components in the core. Many of you are probably not familiar with the Kender reactor. I am familiar with the Kender reactor, so I just decided to put a diagram of the Kender reactor in there, not to be focusing exclusively on light water reactors. Kender reactor is a heavy water reactor. It contains hundreds of fuel channels. These are pressure tubes which go through the core of the reactor. And to a large extent, most of the internals inside a Kender reactor are made from zirconium alloys. And the reason for that, as many of you may or may not know, is because the Kender reactor runs on natural uranium. And running on natural uranium, you don't have much enrichment. Well, you have no enrichment, so neutron economy is very important. You need all the thermal neutrons you can get in order to sustain a nuclear reactor when you're dealing with natural uranium. So typically there's a very high thermal flux in the reactor, and that has been shown to have a number of consequences for alloys which are subject to helium embrittlement, nickel alloys. And so I've shown you some nickel alloys here. But what we're mostly interested in are stainless steels. And in the Kender reactor, stainless steels are typically on the periphery. So nickel alloys, perhaps some steels as well, are used for specialized components in the core because as much as possible, one wants to retain as many thermal neutrons as possible, and any material which tends to absorb thermal neutrons is not desirable in the core. So typically the stainless steels are used on the periphery. The calandria vessel, which is this big tank here, is austenitic 304 stainless steel, and the end fittings which are what holds the fuel channels to the zirconium pressure tubes within the core. The end fittings are made of ferritic martensitic 403 stainless steel. Here's a table to show the main alloys used in the main martensitic and austenitic stainless steel used in the Kender reactor. The low alloy steels here refer to feeder pipes. I mean, typically there are thick pipes which hold the coolant at the inlet and the outlet. And this is out of the course, so I'm not going to be talking about these at all. It's similar kind of material to pressure vessel steels. The in-core components, or the components that will be subject to some neutron exposure, are the 403 and 410 stainless steels, which are used in the end fittings, martensitic stainless steels. And the calandria vessel itself is primarily made of 304 stainless steel, although there are some components, I'm not sure where, made of 316, perhaps some specialized parts of the calandria structure. In fast reactors, we have, again, a number of applications for stainless steels, mostly in fuel cladding. So either austenitic or ferritic. Now, as many of you probably know, there's a risk with ferritic steels for embrittlement at low temperatures, but fast reactors are typically operating at very high temperatures. So whether you're talking about a fast reactor or a Gen 4 reactor, we're generally thinking in terms of high temperature operation. And under those circumstances, the ferritic steels are perfectly sound. And there's no concern with low temperature embrittlement. Or I should say less concern. So let's move on and talk about some physical metallurgy of stainless steels. Here's a thing called the Schaeffler diagram. This was first devised by a guy called Schaeffler, and it was related to welds. And when you have a liquid zone formed during welding, you're melting the material, and for various reasons, the interest is in what kind of phases do you get from the cooling of the liquid zone. And the Schaeffler diagram tells you for given alloy compositions, for given mixes of alloy compositions, what the expectation is in terms of what the alpha phase content, which is the BCC phase, or the martensitic content. Now, in this particular case, they don't define what martensite is. It probably refers to the body-centered tetragonal phase. In this particular case, I'm guessing because it's a cooling or a quenching type process. So I guess what we should do, well, I will be talking about different types of martensite. That's so we'll just leave that aside for right now. The important thing to know that even in what are ostensibly austenitic steels, there's also, you want to expect to find a little bit of alpha, depending on heat treatment and the thermomechanical history of the component. Apart from the phase differences one might see, there are a number of type precipitates that one might come across in steels. So I've highlighted them here, different phases. The gamma prime, the gamma prime is something specific to the high nickel content steels such as A286, and the gamma prime is an ordered phase nickel 3 aluminum based, and it's very important for precipitation hardening. So one can increase the strength of an alloy through precipitation hardening via an aging process, and this is something that's utilized quite a lot in nickel alloys for producing high strength material. There are Laves phases, typically here shown here. I note they don't have, oh yeah, niobium iron 2 is a particular interest for me because there's been quite a bit of controversy in the zirconium field about the existence of Laves phases in niobium alloys, and it seems to me that we likely have niobium iron Laves phases as we do with stainless steels, but there's a number of two different camps, and some people believe that they're ZrFe2 Laves phase, even though there's never been any evidence for those. So these are the Laves phases that one might find. I'm not going to talk too much about what the structure is. All you need to know is that they're hard intermetallic phases. And then you have a whole bunch of carbides and nitrides to deal with. Here's a typical TTT diagram when it comes to in relation to the types of phases one might form, primarily carbides, but this piece of work by, I think it's Phil Maziz, also talks about other phases, other intermetallic phases, which I didn't list on the table previously. These other phases, the sigma and the chi phases, are, I think, not very well defined, although they are reported as when the structure is reported. But basically, you get the idea from this. The main thing that dictates the properties, especially when it comes to stress corrosion cracking, for instance, is the formation of carbides. Because when a carbide forms, particularly at the grain boundary, it'll deplete the surrounding matrix of the metal component. And if that metal component is chrome, then that can have some consequences for a sensitization, what's called sensitization of the material. So we have this typical nose shape that exists for a TTT diagram, and that exists because on the one hand, you have to be at a low enough temperature to that the precipitates can form, and you can get some binding between atoms, but it has to be at sufficiently high temperature that diffusion is rapid enough that you can see precipitation at a reasonable rate. So it's a trade-off between having a low enough temperature to form the precipitates and having a high enough temperature to grow the precipitates. And that's why you get this typical snout, as you see here. And I think the main thing to note is that typically at these low temperatures, 500 to 400 degrees Celsius, certainly at reactor operating temperatures, the time it would take to form any precipitates, carbides, typically is very long. As I said, we're mostly talking about the austenite FCC phase, and although A286 is the main alloy, I'm not sure if it's the only alloy, which is classed as a stainless steel, which is used in nuclear reactors. It's useful to understand what the main aspect of the hardening effect in A286 is. And basically, a lot of the strength, like factor of, maybe 60, 70% of the strength of precipitation hardened alloys comes from the formation of precipitates, in this case, ordered gamma prime precipitates. And what you have is a structure which would typically be, let's say it's nickel based, but it's in the case of an alloy, it's a mixture of nickel, chrome and iron. But if there's sufficient nickel, the stable structure is FCC. And if you have titanium or aluminum, you can substitute at various points in the FCC lattice and create a precipitate which has this structure. This type of precipitate is very common in superalloys because it has the interesting ability to, or the interesting attribute that the yield strength of the CRSS in this material, in this gamma prime material, increases with increasing temperature. But superalloys typically contain about 80% of this, and that's where it really shows up. But in A286 or other nickel alloys, we're talking perhaps less than 10%. So other than acting as a barrier to dislocation slip, the superalloy aspect of it becomes less important. And here's a bit of the periodic table to show which are the gamma prime formers: aluminum, titanium, also niobium, tantalum, that primarily more to do with gamma double prime, but I digress because we're talking about stainless steels, and the gamma double prime is something which one would find in a nickel alloy such as alloy 718, which contains niobium, tantalum. The elements which are soluble in the austenite phase are shown, and also those elements that precipitate on grain boundaries. The carbon is the most important one, although a little bit, if you have any boron in there, it's a little bit perhaps. The carbon is the main one, which affects the properties of steels. You might want carbon in there to strengthen the material, but if you haven't heat treated the material correctly, having carbon precipitating at the wrong time in a thermomechanical process may not be very good. Again, because by forming on grain boundaries, carbides will deplete whatever metal that they combine with, and the one that's most important is chromium. And if you form a carbide on the grain boundary, the surrounding matrix is depleted in chromium. So that can be tricky when it comes to intergranular attack, because one of the reasons that one adds chromium is that it's resistant to corrosion, but also for dissolution by solvents such as the issue I'm most familiar with is intergranular attack by nitric acid, and that was a particular issue for nickel alloys in CANDU reactors in the vault region that were exposed to moist air. So you get nitric acid formed in a reactor environment because of all the gamma rays, and if you're sensitized and you have carbides precipitating at grain boundaries, depleting the chromium, you will get preferential attack at the grain boundary. Now, it also, having chromium there not only is good for resistance to acid attack, but it's also good for resistance to corrosion. And we'll be talking about that later. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the tensile properties of materials as we're discussing physical metallurgy. Here's a summary taken from Gary Wass's book, illustrating typically what the effect of irradiation is on the stress strain curves of an FCC material or a BCC material. So, and this would be a ferritic stainless steel or an austenitic stainless steel. So typically what you get is a reduction in ductility and an increase in the yield strength. But the noteworthy point about austenitic steels, austenitic materials, is the ductility isn't drastically reduced. It still retains some ductility, whereas ferritic steels are subject to a significant reduction in ductility when they're irradiated. And that's one reason why if it's a low enough temperature, or certainly in a light water reactor operating at 3 to 350 degrees centigrade, you don't get ferritic steels used within the core. Of course, ferritic steels are used as the pressure boundary, but they're subject to a very low neutron flux. So we don't get very far along this curve, although there is some embrittlement from the low neutron exposure that the pressure vessel steel is exposed to. But we're not, this isn't, subject of this lecture is not about ferritic steels in pressure vessels, which are one would class as low alloy, not ferritic steels, but low alloy steels. Ferritic steels I don't think are used in pressure vessels. Anyway, the issue is that irradiation gives a drastic reduction in the ductility of a BCC material compared to FCC material at a low enough temperature. If it's a higher temperature, as I said, it's not such an issue, and that's why ferritic steels are candidates for use in Gen 4 reactors. However, this does not apply to helium embrittlement. So if you've got helium around, all bets are off. It becomes another issue. And it's not just a simple case of reducing the ductility as we see here. Or I should point out there's this load drop that you see here, this little dimple here, that when the material yields, it typically it softens very quickly. That's a softening effect here. Sorry. That's a softening effect here. So, and we'll talk about that, the mechanism for this load drop, which some of you may be very familiar with and some of you might not be familiar with. So, but the most important thing I want to just establish and emphasize right now is helium embrittlement is a whole new issue. It's a whole different issue. Sorry, not new, but it's different. And so you don't apply the same rule of thumb to materials which contain helium. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to digress a little bit and show you some results for, instead of an iron, a chrome, titanium alloy, which would be essentially a stainless steel. There are the results from Brasky from back in 1986 on vanadium, chrome, titanium. And what Brasky showed was that here's a typical unirradiated curve, and vanadium is just like iron. It's a BCC stabilizer. So this is an alpha phase alloy. So we have this unirradiated response, and it's quite ductile. It's quite good, but you have this typical characteristics that when you irradiate, the ductility drops significantly, and the radiation temperature is 520 degrees C. But the most important thing I want to point out is that there's the characteristic. I should draw that maybe. There is the characteristic change in both the yield strength and the ductility with increasing dose. But when you have helium present, and Brasky was looking at different levels of helium, 74 there, but 300 here. When you have helium present, if there's sufficient amounts of helium, what you then get is what you can get, I should say, is a drastic reduction in the strength of the material and a further reduction in ductility because of the helium. Now, Brasky showed, oh, damn it, I got to get rid of that. Brasky showed that that the embrittlement that we see here, the reduction in ductility where the material essentially fails in the elastic region, essentially nil ductility, is characteristic of an intergranular failure in this particular case. So when they looked at the fracture surface, it was clearly intergranular. And he showed that this was associated with helium, I don't know whether you can call them bubbles, but certainly helium stabilized cavities on grain boundaries. So that's important. That's something that you have to bear in mind, that that's a characteristic of some embrittlement. A little bit of an interesting aside, there was a paper This was written in 1986, the paper in 1991, talking about irradiation of the same group of alloys that Brasky was looking at, and it even quotes Brasky in terms of having studied these alloys. That was a paper by Gellies and company, but they never talk about helium. Maybe it's because they selected a particular set that weren't implanted with helium. I don't know. But helium didn't show up as an issue, but they did talk about swelling. And it seems to me, certainly in the past, there was a certain association between an expectation. If you had high swelling, you'd get embrittlement. But this particular sample of Brasky's, I think had a, I can't remember exactly, but I think the swelling was around about 2% or something like that, quite small. And it doesn't matter. You can have very low swelling. If all of your cavities segregate to the boundaries, you're going to be brittle. Okay, let's move on now to the physical metallurgy. I'll talk further about the physical metallurgy. We're discussing ferritic stainless steel. Ferritic stainless steel. Sorry, mental blank. We're discussing ferritic stainless steel when we're talking about this structure. The body's mostly about this structure, although martensite comes into play, and I'll be talking about martensite in a few minutes. And when we talk about austenitic stainless steel, we're talking about this structure, an FCC structure. And I've put hexagonal close pack structure there. So this just shows these are the not the braviolas, it's just the atom positions in the lattice, where basically where atoms would occupy a lattice in these three types of materials. And you may be thinking, well, why have you put hexagonal there? Well, the reason I got it here is because in many stainless steels, often what you might see come up is what's called martensite, epsilon martensite. So epsilon martensite is a product. You can form epsilon martensite both from the FCC or the BCC. And in fact, it's an intermediary between, if you were to make a transition between FCC and BCC, HEP is the epsilon martensite can be an intermediary. Oh, didn't want to do that. Not quite sure why that didn't show up. Oh, okay. Anyway, I was going to show something else about hexagonal, but I'll get onto that later. With these three crystal structures, which you'll come across in stainless steels, each one has a characteristic plane within the material where you have a high density of atoms. And typically when you have a high density of atoms, that is typically what would define where you will get a lot of shearing, slip in this particular case. And so the Burgers vector for a slip on the 110 plane in the BCC, God damn it, I didn't do that very nice, is this one. Did a lousy bent Burgers vector there. And it's on this plane. And likewise, the Burgers vector in an FCC is a 110 Burgers vector. It's this one. It's where this atom will just move that far in a perfect translation. So it involves each of these processes involves a series of partial shears where the atoms will move to intermediate low energy configurations, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The hexagonal close pack metal if we were an ideal packing, which is simply spheres which are stacked together, the nearest thing to isotropic that one could get, and that's typically close to magnesium. So magnesium is very close to ideal packing. That is the shortest Burgers vector to 1,1 bar 2. Forgive the Bravais, the Miller-Bravais notation here. All you need to know is that that's the direction. But you should know that in hexagonal materials, probably the most significant thing about hexagonal materials is A, they're isotropic, but also that characteristic one plane that you have to worry about, the main slip plane. Although even in a BCC, although FCC, that is the only slip plane that one would observe. In BCC, there are others, like in the FCC. So, sorry, in the HCP. So in the HCP, depending on what the C/A ratio is, the planar atom density or the electron density in different planes varies depending on what the material is. So if you had something like zinc and cadmium, the base, or even magnesium to some extent, the basal plane is the most densely packed, and there you'll get most action, whether it's slip or loop formation or whatever. You get most action related to that higher density of plane. However, when you move to zirconium and titanium, for instance, these planes, these pyramidal and prismatic planes, become the dominant plane because they actually end up being the higher density of planes, even though they may be corrugated. Or, well, not maybe, they are corrugated. But again, I don't need to get into that for the sake of this particular discussion. So I mentioned that the body center cubic, even though this is the main slip system that exists, basically to 111 Burgers vectors, direction of slip on a 110 plane. Face center cubic is a 110 Burgers vector on a 111 plane. And so I've highlighted here in red arrows that indicates the most common slip systems, but the common slip systems in the hexagonal naturally only relate to some of the hexagonals. But when you change the C/A ratio, these the close packed planes differ. So I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about what the structures are. So in terms of ping pong balls. So one of the things that you have to be aware of is that both the FCC and the HCP are what's called close packed structures. And I'll show you just in a minute what I mean by that. And what that means is that you can construct either one just by simply stacking up balls. It can be cannonballs, can be ping pong balls, whatever you want. And the difference between FCC and HCP is in the stacking sequence. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that in a minute. So you can probably, for those that have a good imagination, you can see that by varying the sites at which you get stacking, you have, if you define one layer, call this an A layer, and then define the next layer as a B layer. In the case of HCP and the FCC, the A and the B layer will be identical. It's the next layer that's important. If you put the atoms at certain positions in the hexagonal it's hexagonal, and at the alternate position, it would be face-centered cubic. So if we have ABC stacking, it's face-centered cubic. If we add ABA stacking, it's hexagonal. You may say that, why are you talking about hexagonal still? And I said, well, my point is, you will see, because this relates to then epsilon martensite formation, which, and again, there's different types of martensite. The BCC structure is an open structure, so it's not close packed and has a whole different considerations one has to apply when talking about stacking and slip. So I'm going to stop the presentation here. If this was a live presentation, I would be simply leaving it on the board, but I can't do that when I'm recording. But what I want to do is illustrate what I mean by this. So I'm going to stop the recording, stop presenting, and I'm going to show you what I mean in clearer terms, hopefully, by what we have here. So I'm going to stop presenting. And now you're going to see my ugly face. And what we're going to show you is a ball model. This particular one is FCC. If you notice, you can see this characteristic hexagonal pattern here. And that's on a 1-1-1 plane. And in FCC, we have the same hexagonal pattern here, which is the other one, another 1-1-1 plane. So just to illustrate what I meant earlier with the stacking, we start with a layer, and you'll notice that we can put the next atoms at different points. So we could put the next layer of atoms at that. Sorry, this is backwards. There. I gotta transpose my left and right to do this. There. There. And there. Or alternatively, there. God damn it. Back to front, there. And there. So let's pick one for the next layer. And as I said, it doesn't really matter whether it's for the first two layers. You got the A and the B layers. They define essentially what the A and the B positions. And you'll notice when I stack them together, you can see some holes through the lattice. So the next layer I can put here and here and here. Sorry, not here, there. Or if I can get the holes lined up again, or I can put them where the holes are. So if I put them where the holes are, that's what's called, that would be then on a C layer. And you can't see through the, call it a C layer because you can't see through it. That's a joke. But if I put it in the other potential position, you can see the holes again. So this is hexagonal, close packed, and it's ABA stacking. And you can see the gaps through the, we only have the A and the B layers, and we leave these sites untouched, which are the C sites. But then if I shear one plane over, and put this third layer on a C site, then we have FCC. So you get the idea, I think, of how these things are aligned. So when it comes to dislocation, slip, or twinning, or something like that, it's good to be aware that when we, if this is the 1-1-1 plane and this is the 1-1-1 plane, the slip typically, well, I'm going to talk about slip later anyway, but typically takes place by two partials, two Shockley partials, two 1-1-2 Burgers vector, or two partials in the 1-1-2 direction. Two 1-1-2 directions that make up this 1-1-0 displacement. So if you notice there, I'm going from this position to this position, two partials back in this position. But and if it's a hexagonal or close packed structure, I have to move every second layer over, and that's a hexagonal structure now, I think. No, it isn't. There, that's a hexagonal structure. Then we have a then we have a different consideration. So in fact, if I do that in the hexagonal is the 1-1-1, 1/1 plane, this particular plane. That's the characteristic atom arrangement for the 1/1 plane. Yeah, okay, so in the hexagonal, this top plane would be the basal plane, the other close packed plane would be this one, which is the 1/1. We'll put it back to cubic FCC, and there we are. Well, that was painful. So I'm going to go back to presenting now. And hopefully I can jump into where we left off. Yeah, I'll resume. Okay. So hopefully this stacking issue makes a little bit more sense to you. Made more sense, probably made sense to you anyway, so I'm wasting, I didn't need to do that, but I thought I'd do it anyway, just in case. So the distinction between the hexagonal phase and the FCC phase is just simply where you put that third layer. I started to talk about slip, and as we're talking about mechanical properties, it's just as well to define what slip is. What do we mean by it? How do you deform a material? Well, many of you have, I think probably all of you are familiar with the notion of the strength of a material. And if you pick an imaginary layer of atoms in a structure, and you simply wanted to break all the bonds all at once to move this layer of atoms in a given direction. I'll get my pointer again. If I wanted to move this layer of atoms in that direction and get to this position, and again, ignore these little black, the fill here. This is an imaginary layer. It's just where we would break the bonds. Typically, that takes enormous stress. I mean, it's basically the theoretical strength of the material and is some fraction of the modulus, either the shear modulus or the Young's modulus, the elastic modulus. And we're talking tens of gigapascals in order to, in terms of stress, in order to break all the bonds at the same time and shift the crystal with respect to the other. However, there's this magic, I shouldn't say magic, but there is this process that can happen, which is, was it discovered by Frank? I don't know. Certainly championed by Frank, FC Frank. He's a doddering old guy who used to come and look over my shoulder when I was doing labs at Bristol. Anyway, so Frank certainly was one of the strong proponents of this concept when it came out in the 40s and 50s about dislocation motion. And one of the ways to think about dislocation motion is instead of breaking all the bonds at the same time, we only need to break one bond or one line of bonds. Imagine I'm looking down a lattice and these are all lined up. So we have a string of atoms stretching off to infinity, if you like, into the page. So we break one line of bonds and we can push this part of the lattice over. And then we only have to break one line at a time in order to move this displacement from here to here to here. So the analogy that people often like to show is caterpillar. The caterpillar only needs to raise up one part of its torso to ripple along and eventually progress. The other analogy is a carpet. If you wanted to move a carpet, it's very difficult to pull a carpet all at once because of the friction that exists across the length of the carpet. But you can push up a little part of it, a ruffle, and work that away, work that across the carpet, and eventually move the carpet a small amount with a lot less force over that process. So we start with a perfect crystal, we start to deform. The other thing to note, the total deformation here, which is, let's call this B, the total shear of this half of the crystal relative to the bottom half of the crystal is only realized once this dislocation has crossed from one side to the other. This part is realized straight away, but at this part of the crystal, it doesn't really know what's going on back here. Maybe a little bit. There's a little bit of a strain energy, elastic displacement coming on here, and you can see that there. But as you get the dislocation as it moves across, eventually that elastic strain which exists here is converted into a plastic strain. So we go by this mechanism, and that way we move from one point to the rest. So after the dislocation has traversed the crystal has no memory of the passage. This is important because you see it often on the internet in different places, but some people have a belief that dislocations distort, change the orientation of a crystal. Now, in the classic sense, no, they don't, because it's a translation. It is not a rotation of the crystal. However, if you were to put a constraint here, block this somehow, the material which wants to deform might buckle a little bit, but that is because of the constraint. So if you have no constraints, there should be no reason to expect any distortion of the crystal in terms of its orientation, simply by the passage of a dislocation. So it's important to know that. So again, keeping it with this idealized sequence, there are two ways in which you can create this shear that we just talked about. This is an edge dislocation, what I've described here. So what we will see is that if we had an edge dislocation, it's the same as breaking a line of bonds here at one edge of the crystal, pushing this half of the crystal over that in that direction, and traversing this edge dislocation from one side to the other. However, you can also achieve the same displacement with what's called a screw dislocation, in which case you start with a line along the length of the crystal, along the other edge of the crystal, and shear the top half relative to the bottom half. Kind of like tearing a telephone book. Not that anybody would tear a telephone book, but if you wanted to move this line, this tear across the crystal, you can do it by again, it's still the same shear process, ultimately, to get the same displacement. But if you, for whatever reason, if the bonds break along this line, then you end up with a screw dislocation as opposed to an edge dislocation. Okay, the other way to deform, again, we're talking about mechanical properties. The other way to deform is by a process called twinning. I mentioned to you just now that slip is a process which doesn't change the orientation of the crystal. So if we shear along a high density plane, which is dislocation slip, we can distort a component. This is a tensile specimen, but the atoms all line up together after you've done that. Twinning, on the other hand, you can get the same distortion, but you've done so. When you do that, you actually distort the crystal and change its orientation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Oh, I should mention, yeah, I mentioned previously that constraints make the difference in this case. And I just want to make it clear, because people often confuse the effect of constraints, which will result in an elastic distortion, can result in an elastic distortion of the specimen, say in a tensile test. And this, as I'll show you, this distortion can impose secondary stress components, which would induce other shearing to occur, either whether it's by twinning or by slip, to relieve those constraints. And I'll talk about that. And yeah, so if it's elastic, then and you're in a tensile test, once you take the sample out of the constraint, this is the shape of the crystal you're going to have, and there's going to be no distortion. So what is the difference between twinning and shear and slip? This is the difference to illustrate here. Slip moves one half of the crystal with respect to another, whether it's edge or screw, and there's no orientation change. Whereas twinning occurs by consecutive shear on a series of different planes. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a minute. It's kind of neat. And in so doing, you get a change in both the orientation, but a different distortion compared to slip. So this dislocation here, I've got one dislocation, but it could be numerous dislocations traversing here, just as we have numerous dislocations here in the case of the twin. The difference between the twin is that it's a slip of one Burgers vector on each, or not one Burgers vector, one shear vector, which could be, it's always a partial, by the way, partial vector on each successive plane, whereas slip can be numerous dislocations gliding all on one plane. And that's typically what's called a slip band. Just to illustrate schematically what twinning refers to, I showed you what the 1-1-1 plane was. That's where most of the ping pong balls are stacked. This is the twinning direction. I'm going to show you what that is, the 1-1-2 twinning direction. And this plane is what's called an invariant plane. It's a 1-1-0 plane. And these are the three things which are the same, both in the crystal and in the twin. So, okay, so I think I'm going to show you now how to distinguish or how to understand what's going on when you have a twin. This is the twinning slip, sorry. The best thing is to show you with ping pong balls, but here it is outlined in a more rigorous way. Slip typically takes place by the combination of two partials, two Shockley partials, 1-6-1-1 bar 2, and they give you a displacement of half 1-1-0 on a 1-1-1 plane. And this is illustrated here. Where a twinning happens by shearing each successive plane by just one of these partials. So each successive plane shears by the same partial. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And again, I'm going to illustrate that now by demonstration. Martensite is similar to a twinning, except it happens on each successive plane. So if you like, it's the equivalent of rearranging the stacking so it becomes ABA when you have a martensite. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. In fact, now, because before we get onto BCC, so I'm going to stop the presenting and I'm going to show you again my little ball models. Yeah. So let's get back to our FCC structure. And I'm going to shear this half of the crystal with respect to that half of the crystal. And I shear using, so I'm going from this atom to this atom. So I'm going 1, 2. And that's those two Shockley partials. 1, 2. 1, 2. So that's all there is to it, in fact. But now, if I wanted to apply a twinning operation, instead of having those two separate Shockleys give me this displacement, this displacement, I shear every successive plane by one Shockley partial. And that is a twin. So I should mention, if I wanted to twin again, do the other Shockley partial, I can bring the crystal back into register by the operation of two twinning operations. So let's go back again now to this state of the FCC structure. And I mentioned that Martensite, epsilon Martensite formation is a little bit like twinning. But I'm going to shear every other plane. So instead of every plane moving by one Shockley, I'm going to shift one plane, that one, and then that one. And now I have my characteristic 1/1 close pack plane that exists in the hexagonal material. I've created a hexagonal material. That's my basal plane still. That doesn't change. And I've done that by shearing every other plane. Every other plane. And that's the Martensite transformation. Now, what's interesting is if we're hexagonal as we are now, and I try and execute a twinning shear, let's say this is hexagonal structure, it's hexagonal, let's say it's zirconium or something like that right now, and I try and shear as a twinning operation. And if you remember, the thing about the shear is that every plane goes in the same direction, the same Shockley. And I can do that on my first layer. There we go, in hexagonal. But my second layer, there's a barrier. It can't move in the same direction. And that's why in hexagonals, you don't see twins on the basal plane, because it can't. There's no way for a hexagonal material on the basal plane to shear with successive planes. This is kind of a aside. I'm sorry, you're going to have to bear with me. Apologies for that. But in the hexagonal case, if we look at other planes, let's say this is the basal plane, but this is the 1/1 as that characteristic structure that characterizes the 1/1 plane, this pyramidal plane, we'll call it a pyramidal plane. If I have that structure and I want to shear in terms of if you like, by the same partial on each successive plane, I can start how you'd normally glide on a 1/1 plane is it goes 1, 2, 3. There's 3 partials. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. I got this back to front, so 1, 2, 3. I wish I was in a classroom so I could show you this easier. Anyway, there's 3 partials involved. But if I move one partial on that plane, I can also move the same partial on the next plane. So I have all the elements there. I have all the elements there to do a twin, to have a twinning operation. I can apply the same shear, and it's a partial now. It's some weird, well, that's 6-2 Obatu. No, that's not 6-2 Obatu 3. That's, I forget what the vector is, but it's some odd 162 bar 4 2 3 or something like that. You have this odd shear, partial shear, but I can do it on each plane. I can do on that plane and then that plane. I'll do the bottom layer first and then this layer. So anyway, the point is, for hexagonal crystal, if I'm on a pyramidal plane, I can create a twin. And that's why in hexagonals you see twinning on non-basal planes. I'm going to go back to presenting now because that's enough on that. I'm going to resume. So I hope that's clear. So what happens when you have equal partials on each successive plane, you end up over the three planes with a displacement, which is, sorry, go back, with a displacement, which is this one. You get from this atom essentially over the top of this atom, but it's over three planes. You go, the full displacement is this amount, and there's 3, 1, 6, 1, 1 bar 2 displacements, gives you a half 1, 1 bar 2, but it occurs on each successive plane. So any one plane, the shear in any one plane is only that much. And then the next plane above gives you that much, the next plane above gives you that much. And then over the bulk, over three planes, we end up with this kind of displacement. For a slip, we end up with a different displacement. But as I say, now emphasize this, for twinning, there's nothing stopping the thing twinning again or again and again. The only thing that's stopping it is constraints, are constraints from the surrounding material. So the epsilon martensite transformation to the hexagonal close packed phase involves the same Shockley partial as the twin, except on every other plane. Kind of neat. It's really helpful to have Bohr models because it really helps one understand deformation in these materials. Ooh, now we get to BCC. So BCC, ferritic steels, a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to get into the full details. This isn't a lecture that's focused on distinguishing about all the different possible slip systems on all different materials. I'm just going to focus on the main one. And as you may remember, in the case of the BCC, we have a shear on the 110 plane, and the shear direction will take you here from this point to this point. That is a 111, half 111 in this particular case. So there are three partials, you see them here, and it isn't that clear, but if one wanted to twin on this plane, in fact, for instance, this first partial B1 here, it is possible on each successive plane. So in effect, you can shear on the 110 or 1 bar 10 plane. I use the ID for the vectors for the planes. You'll probably notice I say 110, but it just means it can be some combination of negative and positive indices. So let's look a little bit closer at what's going on in a BCC. So before I show you again what slip is, this is a diagram showing how the atoms are aligned one on top of the other in the BCC lattice. And for comparison, this shows you the alignment with the FCC lattice. What you want to note here is, although you have a body-centered cubic cell, these are the cubes, there's some corners of the cubes, and there's the body-centered part. You can redraw it or reimagine it as an orthorhombic cell. And the orthorhombic cell, where this face, this face is the 110 plane. And here's the view from the side, and here's the top view of that particular plane. So I'm going to talk about slip, but also martensite formation, because when it comes to shearing of a BCC, the most important aspect of that is the martensitic transformation between BCC and hexagonal close packed. And I've got that wrong. Shit. That's a 110 plane on the BCC. Sorry, I've misindexed that. So I'm gonna crap. That's a 110 in the BCC. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to break out again, stop presenting, and show you a BCC in the ball model. A little bit trickier. So here's my BCC structure. It's kind of hexagonal in a way, but you'll notice that it has these gaps, bigger gaps. And what I've done here is mark the atoms that constitute the top face of that orthorhombic cell that I just described. So let's put on the layer below. You can see where the second layer sits with respect to this orthorhombic face. So, God, that's bright. Where that happened. So, what I'm going to do is going to shear. 1, 2, 3. There you go. So those 2, 3. So that's my shearing operation. I'm not going to get into the martensite until I get back to the presenting. So what I showed you there was the shear of this top layer marked by red with respect to this bottom layer shown here. So but just as with the epsilon martensite formation, martensitic transformation from FCC to HCP, which is reversible, by the way. So when I say FCC to HCP, it's HCP to FCC also. One can have a similar transformation from BCC to HCP, as described here. And it involves a partial, which is 1/8 bar 10. And as I said, one could twin, but if you only sheared by every other plane, in effect, you get close to what's called the BCC structure. I'm being silly. That's not a bar one. Well, yeah. That's not a bar one bar 1-0. Oh man. That's correct. That is actually the 1-0 direction, or the 0-1 direction. And I was getting myself confused here. Because this is the 1-0 plane, and the 1-1-0 plane is this one. I'm going to pause this. Okay. I'm going to pause this now. This would be like a break in the meeting. Stop recording.